Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing an editing tutorial which I haven't done in a really long time. This is probably the first one I've done in probably a couple of months actually. I can't even remember the last time I did one. So this tutorial is going to be all about adding contrast to your images, specifically to your portraits. And I feel like there is a little bit more to adding contrast a lot of the time to your portraits than just, you know, the contrast slider in Photoshop or Lightroom. And I wanted to show you guys a few techniques that I've been using to really get a bit of contrast back into my photos, especially for photos that look a little bit more flat, like this particular one that I'm going to show you, and ones that don't have a lot of life to them in terms of highlights and that sort of things too. So I really want to show you guys how to make the highlights pop in photos too, and I think that's really important when it comes to adding contrast. So first off, I've just got my image here from Camera Raw. I actually do use Lightroom most of the time to do any initial adjustments, but because I'm importing this straight into Photoshop from my computer, I'm just going to do this through Camera Raw. So usually I would just move the contrast slider up a little bit. That's probably my first step. It'll give a little bit more contrast and a little bit more clarity as well, just to sharpen things up a little bit. And maybe a little bit more exposure on this one. I do tend to like to underexpose a little bit with my photos, so sometimes I can go a little bit too dark. So I think that's pretty good. So we're going to open this now into Photoshop. And the first technique I'm going to show you today is to do with skin editing. So if you haven't watched a lot of my tutorials before, most of my skin editing I do with dodging and burning. I also use frequency separation, but not for all of my images. On this occasion, I'm just going to use a bit of dodging and burning because Elsa's skin is pretty much perfect. We just need to clean up a little bit of it. And what we're going to do as well is just go over those highlights to make them pop a little bit more. So usually to dodge and burn, my favorite method at the moment is just to create a curves adjustment layer. So you go to the adjustment layer box down here and go up to curves. And you'll just bring the curve up. This will be the dodging layer. So you'll bring this dot right up to around there, just so it's super bright and overexposed. And now I'm going to hold down Control and I to invert that layer. And you can see that this has turned into a black box now and it's not white. We are going to keep that box selected and we're going to make sure the paintbrush is selected this time. Flow is at 1% and white is the selected color. This is going to paint back the light onto the image. So we're essentially dodging but using a non-destructive method to do so. So I'm going to zoom into her face, make this a little bit bigger. And we're going to start with the paintbrush, maybe get a little bit smaller, maybe around 34 pixels. And I'm just going to go over the parts that I think need to be lightened up a little bit, any unevenness in the skin tone, just to make it look a little bit more even. Okay, so just to show you guys how that has improved Elsa's skin tone there, I'm just going to turn that layer on and off, and you can just see that the parts of the skin tone that were a little bit uneven are now more even. My next move for the dodging would be to go over the highlighted parts that are already highlighted, just so it doesn't look too funny, because if I'm to highlight parts of the image that aren't already highlighted, it can tend to look a bit doll-like and maybe a little bit fake at times. So we're just going to stick to these areas that are already light, and we're just going to brighten them up a little bit more, make them stand out in a corner of her eye and below her brow bone too. And also above her lip, just anywhere there's some little highlights. and also a little bit on the cheekbone as well. Okay, so once again, I'm going to turn that layer on and off, and you can see that it's just kind of enhanced those areas a little bit more. I'll zoom out for you guys as well and show you once again. So you can see the difference that that has made. Now, I've found that I don't do too much burning within photographs a lot of the time. So on this occasion, I'm not going to do any burning, which would just be using the same technique, but instead in the curves layer would be to bring the bar down instead of up. I'm not going to do any burning because I feel like some parts of Elsa's face are dark enough, and with some of the techniques I'm about to use, they will bring a little bit more contrast into the image anyway. And I know that there's a few stray hairs floating around and a couple of dust specks in the image, but for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to stick to the ways to improve contrast, and I've got other videos explaining how to do those other things. So our next step is going to be to add another adjustment layer, so just down on this button down here. And then we're going to choose black and white. So as you can see, that adjustment layer has turned it into black and white, but we can change this. So what we're going to do now is we're going to click on tint. And it automatically gives you this kind of nice skin color coloring, really. So we're actually going to stick with that, but we are going to change the layer mode down here to luminosity. And that way it's sort of sitting on top of that, only really adding a little bit more extra contrast. But the way we're going to do this is I really, really want to get more of Elsa's skin tone back into the image as far as the texture. She's got a lot of really cool freckles, and I really want to bring that back into the image. It is looking a little bit washed out at the moment due to some of the lighting. So we're going to start with the reds and yellows, and really they're going to be the main sliders that we're going to use for this tutorial because the others aren't really contributing to much the color in the photo. And reds and yellows will contribute to the skin tone. So we're going to select reds first, and we're going to play around with this slider just so it's giving us a little bit more contrast. And we have to move that down. Yellows as well. I'm going to move that down a little bit more. Maybe a little bit less red. And automatically you can see how much of a difference that's actually made just by using those two sliders. Now I'm going to turn this layer off and show you guys the difference that's made, which is pretty crazy. I mean, that's really the bulk of how I like to do my contrast with portraits. So some people might think that this is a little bit too heavy, which is totally fine. But I like to use a few other techniques as well to get my contrast a little bit more subtle. So what we'll do now, after adding that little bit of texture back, we're going to go into the adjustment layers again and go selective color. Now, by creating contrast in photographs, I also like to do this with coloring. So if we go into the whites and neutrals and blacks, this will really change the whole look of the image. So with whites, I'm actually going to keep them quite cool. So I'm going to move the cyan slider up a little bit just to get a bit more of a cooler tone in the highlights. And I'm going to move the magenta one a little bit down to get, not that much, but a little bit of green in the highlights. Sort of keeping that cool tone there. And on the yellow, I'll move it down to the blue side. So moving it down to around, say, -7. Now I'm going to work on the neutrals. I'm not going to make too many changes with this particular channel. I'm just going to move up magentas a little bit to +2, and the yellows as well. I'm going to move up to +2 as well. So we're keeping the warmth in the neutral areas and the cool tones are going to be in the highlights. So we are creating a bit of a contrast there. I'm also going to go into the blacks as well. And don't worry if it looks too saturated at the moment, we are going to fix this. So I'm going to put a little bit of magenta in the blacks as well. And a little bit of yellow as well. So it's really giving us a little bit of contrast with the coloring there. And as you can see, just by turning that layer off, we're kind of giving it a bit more of an interesting look and going a bit more into color toning. So we can actually adjust this layer a little bit. I might actually just bring the opacity on this down a little bit to maybe about 80% for now, just so it's a little bit more subtle. The next adjustment I'm going to make is also another adjustment layer. So we'll bring up an adjustment layer that is levels. And I always like to add a little bit more highlight with levels because I feel like it does it best. Sometimes curves for me just doesn't bring out the highlights enough. Even though curves is definitely my favorite tool probably in Photoshop, I would say that levels just does a little bit better of a job in bringing out some of the highlights a bit more. So we're just going to move that down a little bit and move in the blacks just slightly, not too much, because there's already a bit of contrast in the shadows. So that is done, and now I think I'm just going to cool down the photo a little bit. And sometimes to do this, the best way to do it is to click on a solid color and then go down to just sort of like a deep dark blue color. Any really cool tone blue color would work. And then set that to soft light and move the opacity right down, probably to around, let's say 10%. And I'll show you guys what that's done. It's just kind of given it a little bit more of a cooler tone overall. Just something that I like to do a lot of the time with my images. And then the next adjustment and the final adjustment that we're going to make is just by adding a vibrance adjustment layer. And this isn't really anything to do with the contrast or anything. This is just getting rid of a little bit of the vibrance. So I think we're just going to pull that down to around, let's say, -6. So guys, that is the finished look of this image. I'm going to show you now a before and after. So we'll go to the before image. So you can see how much of a difference it's made in Elsa's skin tone with those adjustments. It looks very washed out here and very monotonal in terms of coloring. And if we go back to this image now, you can see there's a lot more contrast in the image. Now, this is all to people's tastes as well. You may not like how contrasted this is, or you might like it. The great thing is about these adjustment layers is that you can adjust them to however you like. So if anything looks too heavy or anything looks too bright or too dark, you can adjust it to how you like your images to look. So this is a really good way of trying to add contrast in Photoshop rather than just going brightness contrast or exposure or any of the default lighting adjustment layers that are there in Photoshop. So guys, thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I really hope you guys liked it and you got some helpful hints out of it. If there's any requests that you'd like to make, please do, as I'm currently traveling and definitely after new ideas for videos, and I really always love to hear what you guys want to see on my channel and what you want to learn. So I'm happy to do any requests at the moment. Feel free to send those through. If you'd like to keep up with my travels, I've currently got a channel with my boyfriend Dan called Wonderwalkers. That is listed in the description box below, so you can follow all the travel vlogging that I've been doing over the last couple of months. And let me know your favorite ways to create contrast in Photoshop and what you like to use as far as the tools and the adjustment layers are concerned, what you really like to use on your own images, because I'm always interested to hear what other people's processes are for this sort of thing as well. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!